Galveston, Texas, September 7th, 1900. On that Friday afternoon, on the beaches on the south side of the island, families were enjoying the last hours of sun over the Gulf of Mexico. The summer of 1900 had been extraordinarily hot, and Galveston had easily become the favorite destination of wealthy families from Houston and Dallas, with beachfront hotels operating at full capacity since June. As families returned to their rooms and hotel cooks prepared dinner, the sky on the southern horizon had an orange and heavy hue that did not seem common with the usual late afternoon, a color that some of the island's older fishermen noticed, but that did not stop them from tying up their boats and heading home like any other Friday. As the afternoon moved into evening, inside the famous Tremont Hotel, cotton businessmen were closing their meetings over whiskey and cigars while the last streetcars passed along Market Avenue. At the same time, at the port of Galveston, stevedores finished loading the last bales of cotton onto ships that would depart for New Orleans and Liverpool before the end of the week. Galveston moved more cotton than any other port in the United States that year, and the city had grown around that wealth for decades, with banks, hotels, mansions, and a waterfront that attracted visitors from all over Texas during the summer. What no one imagined was that 1,200 kilometers to the south, over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, a storm that had crossed the Atlantic from the coast of Africa continued to intensify with winds already exceeding 160 kilometers per hour. Isaac Klein, the meteorologist responsible for the United States Weather Service office in Galveston, had received warnings that afternoon from Cuba about an approaching storm, read all the reports, and, incredibly, found no reason to issue any alert to the population. And that decision brought about the end of America's leading commercial center. Galveston in 1900 was no ordinary city in the American South. It was the gateway of Texas to the world. Founded decades earlier as a strategic trading point on the island that separates the Gulf of Mexico from Galveston Bay, the city had transformed into the most important financial and commercial center in the state. With a population of 37,000 inhabitants spread across an island just over 48 kilometers long and 3 kilometers wide at its widest point, cotton was the backbone of everything. Farmers from the interior of Texas sent their harvests by railroad to Galveston, where the cotton was stored in enormous warehouses along the port before being shipped to textile mills in England and New England. The cotton brokers who worked on Strand Street, the city's main commercial avenue, closed deals that moved millions of dollars a year. The banks that financed these operations were among the best capitalized in the South. In 1900, Galveston processed more than 1/3 of all cotton exported by the United States. That wealth had built a city that surprised those arriving for the first time. The mansions on Broadway Avenue, built by the merchants and bankers who had grown rich on cotton, had facades of imported brick, tree-lined gardens, and verandas overlooking wide streets with well-kept sidewalks. The Tremont Hotel received politicians, businessmen, and travelers from across America. The port operated 24 hours a day, with ships of every flag docked along kilometers of wooden piers. Galveston had electric street lighting, a streetcar system, 3 daily newspapers, and a medical school that attracted students from all over Texas. The island's residents had grown up living with the Gulf of Mexico as a natural part of daily life. The beaches on the south side attracted bathers throughout the summer. The families who lived in the houses closest to the waterfront were accustomed to the constant breeze, the smell of salt, and the sound of the waves. For the sons of fishermen who lived in the humbler neighborhoods near the port, the sea was where their fathers had worked since before dawn. For the wealthy families who vacationed in the beachfront hotels, it was the backdrop of a way of life that seemed solid and permanent. Hurricanes were not unknown on the Texas coast. In 1886, a hurricane had destroyed the neighboring city of Indianola so completely that it was never rebuilt. Engineers and municipal authorities in Galveston had discussed at that time the possibility of building a seawall along the south shore of the island to protect the city from future storms. The proposal was studied, budgeted, and filed away, with the argument that a seawall would cost too much and would disrupt access to the beaches that attracted tourists and visitors during the summer. On the morning of Saturday, September 8, 1900, the downtown bakeries opened before 6 in the morning as usual. And in the neighborhoods near the port, women lit stoves to prepare breakfast while their husbands got ready for another shift at the docks. In the boarding houses and hotels along the waterfront, guests who had arrived during the week to enjoy the weekend at the beach came down for breakfast without noticing anything out of the ordinary, because the overcast sky and the wind that had picked up during the night were a normal part of September in the Gulf of Mexico. Hot, humid, and with frequent weather changes that rarely meant anything more than a rainy afternoon. Isaac Klein woke early that morning and went to the waterfront to check sea conditions, where he found something different from usual, with waves coming from an uncommon direction, from the north rather than the east, and the tide higher than expected for that time of day, flooding some streets near the beach that normally stayed dry even during the summer's highest tides. Klein rode along the waterfront on horseback for hours, warning residents of the houses closest to the sea to move away from the beach, but without an official evacuation order, without sirens, and without any communication system that could reach the entire island quickly, most of the people who heard the warning did not understand the urgency of what was being said. In the streets of the city center, the markets opened at their usual time, while the churches prepared for morning masses. Children left home to play in the dirt streets of the island's poorer neighborhoods, and the tide continued to rise slowly, advancing through the lower streets of the city without anyone yet understanding what it meant. The residents of the higher parts of the island watched the water in the lower streets with curiosity, not imagining that within a few hours that same water would be reaching the upper floors of the wooden houses that made up most of the city. By 2 in the afternoon, the wind was already strong enough to knock down fences and tear roof tiles from the most exposed houses, and the rain that had begun hours earlier showed no signs of stopping, with the streets near the waterfront already ankle-deep in water and continuing to rise. Some families began collecting their most valuable belongings and moving to the homes of neighbors on higher ground, while others stayed where they were, convinced that the storm would pass as all the others had passed before. The streetcars stopped running in the early afternoon because the streets were too flooded for the tracks to function. The port was closed, and the last ships that managed to leave the anchorage did so with difficulty, battling waves that grew with each passing hour. What no one in Galveston knew at that moment was that the approaching storm had intensified beyond what any meteorological instrument available in 1900 was capable of measuring with precision, with winds at the center of the hurricane already exceeding 240 kilometers per hour, and a wall of water pushing ahead of the storm that measured between 4 and 6 meters in height, advancing directly toward an island whose highest point did not reach 3 meters above sea level. By early evening on September 8th, the water had already taken over the lower streets of Galveston, and the wind blowing in from the Gulf had turned into something the island's oldest residents had never experienced before. The wooden houses that made up most of the city shook with the gusts, with windows opening on their own and doors being torn from their hinges, while the families who had decided to stay tried to seal the gaps with cloth and furniture pushed against the walls. In the streets, the water that hours earlier had reached the ankles was already at an adult's waist and kept rising, carrying with it planks, barrels, animals, and the first debris from the houses that had begun to give way in the lowest parts of the island. The families who tried to leave their homes at that point discovered that the streets had become impossible to cross, with the current strong enough to knock down a grown man, and the darkness almost total because the electrical lines had been brought down by the wind hours earlier, leaving the entire city without lighting at the moment it needed it most. Some residents managed to reach more solid masonry buildings, such as churches and the Tremont Hotel itself, where hundreds of people took refuge on the upper floors while the water rose through the ground floor. Others tried to cling to trees, poles, and any structure still standing while the current tried to drag them away. The most devastating moment came around 8 in the evening, when the wall of water that had crossed the Gulf ahead of the hurricane struck the island with a force that none of the wooden structures making up most of Galveston was prepared to withstand. Entire houses were torn from their foundations and swept away by the current, colliding with other houses and forming masses of debris that moved through the city like battering rams, knocking down everything in their path. Families who had climbed onto rooftops hoping to stay above the waterline watched their rooftops be carried away. People clinging to beams and planks were struck by the moving debris, What remained of Galveston the following morning was not a destroyed city. It was a city that had ceased to exist in the way its residents had known it. The streets where children had played the previous morning were covered in meters of debris, mud, and rubble from houses that hours before had been homes, with family photographs, furniture bought with years of savings, and Sunday clothes still hanging in wardrobes. The merchants of Strand Street, who the evening before had closed their offices thinking about the weekend, did not return to open their doors on Monday. The families who had arrived to enjoy the beaches before the end of summer did not return home the same way they had arrived. And the richest city in Texas, the one that had refused to build a seawall because it would disrupt access to the beaches, woke covered in silence where the day before there had been movement, commerce, and life. The first days after the hurricane were spent searching through the rubble. Families looked for relatives who had been separated during the night. Neighbors dug with their hands through the piles of wood and debris covering the streets, trying to find survivors. The smell that took over the island in the days that followed was unbearable, and the authorities soon realized it would be impossible to bury all the dead on the island itself. So the first bodies were loaded onto barges and cast into the sea, only for the Gulf to return them to the beach days later. The solution found was to build enormous pyres and cremate the bodies directly in the streets, a scene that the survivors who described it in later testimonies compared to something they could not find words to explain. The reconstruction of Galveston began before the rubble had even been completely cleared, and this time, the city did what it had refused to do before. Between 1902 and 1917, Galveston built a seawall 17 kilometers long along the entire south shore of the island, 5.5 meters high, and raised the ground level of the entire city through a landfill process that took years, pumping sand from the bottom of the Gulf beneath every existing building while residents continued to live in them. It was one of the most ambitious engineering projects ever undertaken in the United States up to that point, carried out by a city that had lost an enormous part of its population and that had to find the determination to rebuild everything on a ground the sea had just completely swept away. Galveston never returned to what it had been before September 8, 1900. Houston, which until then had been a smaller and less important city in the interior of Texas, took advantage of the years Galveston spent trying to rebuild to expand its own port and attract the investors and merchants who had lost everything on the island. The cotton that had made Galveston's fortune began to be exported through Houston. The banks that had financed decades of prosperity on the island moved their decision-making centers inland. The city that had been the gateway of Texas to the world never recovered that position. The seawall is there to this day. Anyone visiting Galveston can walk along it and look out over the Gulf of Mexico from the same angle the residents of 1900 looked before the hurricane, with nothing between them and the water. The difference is that now the seawall exists. And the question that remains, looking at that concrete structure that took decades to be built after the tragedy, is why it did not exist before, when engineers had already proposed its construction, when the example of Indianola had already shown what the Gulf was capable of doing, and when the richest city in Texas had enough money and resources to build it without major difficulty. If you made it to the end of this documentary, thank you so much for watching. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment what you thought. See you in the next video.